Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Steve again, Old Man Reads. Unlike most channels who've decided to end the year with a list or their best reads of the year, I'm not going to do that. I decided to just do a final video of the year discussing one of, if not my favorite writer, and that's Haruki Murakami. So I got into Murakami about, 15 years ago, 16 years ago. I was working for a university as an academic counselor, and I also taught an introduction to college class. And I was part of a book club with some of the other academic counselors. And each I don't remember if we did it every 2 weeks or every month. It may have been every month. But each round, somebody else in the club would pick a book. And I read some great books in there. Glass Castles, or is it Glass Castle? I thought was great. We read that. We read World War Z, really stood out. Not what I was expecting. It's one of those books where I expected it to be a zombie book based on the title. And it was more about the aftermath and the survival in a dystopian environment. And then one of the ladies had us read Hard Boiled. What's the name of it? It's got a long name. Let me see if it's here. Hard Boiled Wonderland. I don't have the name of it in front of me, though. Actually, it might be here in the front of the book. That's going to drive me nuts if I don't get it out. Or it'll come to me the minute I stop the video. So, Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. What a great title. What a great book. So that was my introduction to Haruki Murakami. From there, I believe I read Kafka on the Shore, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, A Wild Sheep Chase, Norwegian Wood, 1Q84, Kafka on the Shore. I've read about 10 or 11 of his books now, maybe more actually. But again, he's just become one of my favorite authors. He does a great job of mixing Japan and the what's the word I'm looking for? The tradition of Japan with a little bit of Western ideology. He loves to introduce Western music in there. There's always some really cool connection to music somewhere in his books. He also he listens to jazz while he's writing. Something I remember reading about him a while back. So he is a music lover, and definitely that plays a part in many of his books. But I had read a bunch of his books, so I decided, you know what? I want to read everything from him. So I started at the beginning, and I first did this 3 or 4 years ago. I just reread it again, as I am apt to do with certain artists that I really enjoy. I don't do it often. Maybe every decade or so, I'll go back, or sometimes even 2 decades, I'll go back and reread something that I loved. And the amazing thing about doing that, if you haven't done that, if you haven't gone back and reread a book that you loved, or even one that you didn't like, I do recommend it, because you find new details that you didn't catch the first time through. You see it from a different angle, especially if it's been a long period of time since you first read it. That said, that has nothing to do with this book, but it's just something I recommend. So Haruki Murakami's first book is Hear the Wind Sing. It's the beginning of a trilogy. It wasn't planned that way. It's just kind of the way it worked out. They call it the Rat Trilogy, and it includes Hear the Wind Sing, Pinball 1973, and then A Wild Sheep Chase. A Wild Sheep Chase is widely considered to be his first great novel. And A Wild Sheep Chase is actually a great starting point. I see a lot of lists and a lot of people recommending Murakami, and they always recommend Norwegian Wood. I love Norwegian Wood. I think it's a fantastic book. I wouldn't start with that, though. I wouldn't start with 1Q84. I would probably start where I did with Hard-Boiled Wonderland, or with A Wild Sheep Chase. Maybe even... Yeah, maybe those two. A Wild Sheep Chase is a good one to start with because it's not a super long book. I think it's 350 pages. Oh, look at that, 351. Whereas something like 1Q84, which I absolutely love, is 1,000 pages, 1,200. That was actually originally released as a trilogy in Japan. It was released in the U.S. as one book. So while most of us here in the U.S. think of it as one book, it's thought of as a trilogy there. That said, going back to Hear the Wind Sing, he didn't start out, Haruki Murakami didn't start out as an author. He decided later, I think he was in his late 20s. And it kind of goes into it at the beginning of this book. There's a preface where he kind of gives his introduction and how he got into writing. And... that alone makes this worth reading. And this is a short book. This is a novella. 101 pages. If I remember correctly, it wasn't written as a book. It was written as an entry for a contest. And I think it was published. It might have been published in a magazine over a period of time. I'd have to go back. I skipped rereading the intro or the preface this time. So it's been a while since I read that. But it's really cool. He's got a very different style of writing, and kind of the joke in Japan is it sounds like somebody that is a native English speaker that is writing in Japanese literature, which is kind of an interesting take. And what's really funny about that is when he first started writing, he had been sitting for months and just couldn't get a good start. He would write a few chapters and throw it away. He didn't like the way it sounded. He didn't like the structure of it. So what he did for this first book, and I don't even think he did it for the whole book. I think he just did it for the first couple chapters, is he decided to write it in English. He does read and write in English. Actually, most Japanese read English and write English. They can't speak it very well, though. And the main reason behind that is they only have one way of pronouncing each of their vowels. So they have trouble pronouncing words the way that we do, where we have, 2 or 3 ways of pronouncing each one of our vowels. So, but he wrote the first few chapters in English and then translated them in Japanese. And that's kind of where he got his style from. And what's amazing about this first book, first of all, this first book is not an actual novel. It's not even a story, really. You're just following the unnamed protagonist. So the unnamed protagonist has been in 4 books, I believe. All of the 3 books from the Rat trilogy, and then I believe Dance, Dance, Dance. I haven't read that one yet. It's on my shelf. But I think that one is also the unnamed protagonist, who is a character that I like quite a bit. But this first book is just kind of following him over the last 3 weeks of his summer vacation between the first and second year of college. They don't say the first, second year, but he's in college. He's going back to college. So this is like his summer break. And it just follows the relationship between him, his friend Rat, and a couple ladies, a bartender. It's a very... I personally love it because it takes me back to a time. I lived in Japan for 10 years. I got there when I was 19. I left late. I was almost 20. Well, yeah, 19. I left when I was 28. So I was there for 9 years. Met my wife there, but I grew up in Japan. My early adulthood was there. I really grew as a person there. And that's why a lot of Haruki Murakami's stories really resonate with me, because he's really good at coming of age stories, telling the life of a young man, 18 to 22. And again, I was in Japan for that whole period. So when I'm reading his stuff, I know what the buildings of Japan look like, the apartment buildings, the stores, the delis, the bakeries. They're their own thing in Japan. They're not like they are anywhere else in the world. So it's really fun for me reading his stories because I can really relate to them because I came of age in Japan. Now, and most of his stories take place. This was written in the 70s. I want to say 78. I could be wrong about that, but that era. Now, I see a lot of people talk about the way, complain about the way Murakami writes sex scenes, the way he writes women. Part of that is we're looking at it from the eyes of somebody in 2024 and Western eyes in 2024. You don't really see it in this book, but in the next book you start to see it. And all of his books, the way he writes women, some people find offensive. However, he actually does a great job of writing the kind of weird thoughts that go through a young boy's mind. We think some pretty nasty stuff, some pretty weird stuff in adolescence and on through our 20s until we mature. And he does a good job of capturing that stuff. Also, again, we're looking at it from an American lens or from a Western lens. Most people that would watch my videos are Westerners. In Japan, sex is looked at differently than it is here. Marriage is looked at differently than it is here. The roles of the man and the woman are very different there than they are here. And it's not it's not like a male domineering society like people think it is. The way things work in Japan is the man goes to work, he brings in the money. However, the woman controls the house. So by controls the house, I mean, he gives her the check. She takes care of everything. She goes to the store. She buys the food. She pays the bills. She takes care of the kids. She buys the clothes, the suits for the husband. So it's a very different society, especially at this time. Most of his books are written in the 70s and the 80s or about that period. So when you're reading Murakami, like I said, I've seen a lot of reviews, and the complaints that people have are usually minor, but those are what they kind of revolve around. But like I said, the cool thing about this is you already start to get to see his writing style. He's got a beautiful writing style. I love the way... I hate using the word prose, but I love his prose. In this first book, it really is just an introduction to his writing. It's amazing. Like I said, it's not that much of a story here. It's more of an introduction. And the best way to read it is to read all three of these together. You see me holding two. So the way it works is this is Hear the Wind Song, Hear the Wind Sing, his first book. And then you flip it over, and it's his second book, which is Pinball 1973, which also takes place in this same town with his best friend Rat. And then this book takes place a little while later after college. And like I said, this is really where you start to see the supernatural stuff that he's kind of known for. This is really where we see the Murakami of the next 40 years, basically. But I'll do another video talking about that later. I actually just got the Folio Society version of A Wild Cheap Chase, which was just released, and it's stunning. It's a very, very nicely done book. So I'm going to read that again shortly here. But it's 100 pages. You can get through this in, an afternoon. And it's just kind of a fun introduction. You can see his history, where he came from, how he got to where he is. It's very cool. And it's also cool. Like I said, I read this one first. You can read this as a standalone book. It's not lessened by the fact that you haven't read the first two, which is why this is one... that I recommend people start with a lot of the time. But the surrealism is already super high in this one, whereas you don't see that in these first two books. Another cool thing is he starts talking about Derek Hartfield in this book, this is something that if you haven't read his later books, you won't understand. But he kind of foreshadows what would become the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle years later, where he's talking about Derek Hartfield, who was a prolific writer who spoke of life, dreams, and love. So Hartfield wrote a book, or a short story, called The Martian Wells. And he describes, or the unnamed protagonist in here talks about how in The Martian Wells, which is a real article, he was kind of a predecessor of Ray Bradbury. And Ray Bradbury was very much influenced by Hartfield. But he talks about the Martian Wells, in which the protagonist in that story is a young man who explores many bottomless wells on the planet Mars. And that's something that's a huge part of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. I don't want to talk about it and take away from that book, because it's a fantastic book. But it's kind of cool that that's foreshadowed in this. And that he would he would use that as a major plot line, really, in the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. So kind of a cool foreshadowing that unless you had already read the later books, you wouldn't catch reading this the first time. And again, I've read this, I believe, 3 times now, these first 2 books. And really love them. Again, it's not really a story. It's just following the guy for 3 weeks before he goes off to college. I haven't read Pinwheel 73 in a couple years. I'm about to read that one again. But if I remember correctly, that takes place basically with the same bartender, his best friend Rat. It's got its own little story about the pinball machine, which is actually introduced in the first book as well. So, again, cool book. If you've read Murakami and you like his writing style, and you just want to kind of see where he came from, this is a fantastic place to start, and I do highly recommend it. I love this book. I wouldn't give it a 5, though. It's definitely not that. I'd give it I would call it 3 stars. Some might list it as less, because, again, it's short. There's kind of a bit of world building, but not really. I kind of read a lot of that stuff into it because, again, I lived in Japan, so I can picture exactly what he's describing in this book. So I highly recommend Murakami. I can't recommend him enough to people. But I would not start with Norwegian Wood. I do love that book. I would not start with 1Q84. It's a long book. And I would not start with Kafka on the Shore, although Kafka on the Shore is my favorite book from Haruki Murakami. I would recommend Hard-Boiled Wonderland, A Wild Sheep Chase, or The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. That's it, guys. Have a wonderful New Year, man. I went pretty long on this video and rambled a lot, so I apologize for that. But fantastic book, one of the great writers of the last 50 years. Hear the Wind Sing from Haruki Murakami. Happy New Year's, everybody. I'll talk to you later. Bye.